Have you ever had a thought that just wouldn't leave your mind? A person, a name, an idea? Something that lingers no matter how much you try to ignore it? What if I told you that this isn't just your mind playing tricks on you, but rather a divine message? What if God is trying to get your attention, calling you to be part of something greater than you can imagine? Too often, we overlook these persistent thoughts, dismissing them as coincidence. But what if they are actually whispers from the divine guiding you toward a purpose you don't yet understand? Today, you're going to discover the true meaning behind these thoughts and why they might be God's way of using you for something extraordinary. We'll walk through a powerful story of faith, obedience, and divine intervention, one that will make you rethink every time you've ever felt an unexplained pull towards someone or something. By the end of this message, you'll see how God speaks in ways we often ignore and how answering His call can change not only someone else's life, but your own as well. Before we dive in, let me ask you something. How many times have you felt that persistent nudge but hesitated to act? Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced this. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these life-changing messages. Many people watch our videos but aren't subscribed. Don't be one of them. Hit that button and stay connected to the revelations God is bringing your way. What you're about to hear could completely shift the way you understand God's guidance in your life. So stay with me until the end, because this might just be the sign you've been waiting for. Have you ever found yourself constantly thinking about someone for no apparent reason? No matter how much you try to push the thought away, it lingers, returning when you least expect it. It's as if the universe itself is nudging you towards something deeper. Many dismiss these persistent thoughts as random or fleeting, but what if they are not mere coincidences? What if they are whispers from the divine, guiding you toward a purpose far greater than you can comprehend? Spirituality teaches us that nothing happens by accident. There is always a reason even when we don't see it right away. That's exactly what happened to a man who couldn't get a particular woman out of his head. They were not close, barely acquaintances, yet her presence in his mind was relentless. At first he brushed it off, chalking it up to distraction or curiosity. But as days passed and the thought persisted, he began to wonder, was this simply his mind playing tricks, or was something greater at work? He struggled to make sense of it, but no matter how much he rationalized, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper purpose behind this unshakable thought. When confusion took hold, he turned to the one source that never fails, God. In prayer, he surrendered his restless mind, asking for clarity and guidance. Lord, if this is from you, show me why. That night he received an answer in a way only God could orchestrate, through a dream. In that dream, he saw the woman walking toward a small house. Inside, a desperate family was praying, their hands clasped in faith, tears streaming down their faces. The woman carried bags of food, and as she placed them in front of the family, relief washed over them. It was more than an act of kindness. It was the answer to their prayers. Upon waking, his heart raced. The dream was too vivid to be ignored, too specific to be meaningless. He knew, deep in his soul, that this was not just a dream. It was a divine instruction. God had planted this thought in his mind for a reason. But what now? Should he act on it? Should he tell the woman? Doubt tried to creep in, whispering that it was all just imagination. Yet something even stronger stirred within him. Faith. He couldn't ignore what had been shown to him. And so, he sought her out. When they spoke, he hesitated at first, unsure of how to explain. But to his amazement, before he could even finish, her eyes widened. "I've been feeling the same thing," she said. "I knew I was supposed to help someone, but I didn't know who." At that moment, it was clear. This was no accident. God had connected them for a purpose greater than themselves. But now, the real journey was about to begin. Dreams have long been a vessel for divine messages. Throughout history, God has used them to reveal his plans, warn of dangers, and call his people to action. Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, was warned in a dream to flee to Egypt, Matthew 2:13. Daniel interpreted the dreams of kings, unveiling the mysteries of the universe. And now this man found himself carrying the weight of a vision that demanded a response. It wasn't just a dream. It was a calling, a spiritual mission placed directly in his hands. The images from his dream played over and over in his mind. The small, humble house, the family desperate in prayer, the woman the key to answering their cries for help. It was no longer just about an unshakable thought. It was a revelation. But knowing what to do, and having the courage to do it, are two different things. He could have ignored it, dismissed it as an illusion of the mind. Many do. But something within him, something undeniably divine, compelled him forward. When he met the woman, their conversation confirmed everything. She too had felt an unusual heaviness on her heart. "I knew I was supposed to help someone, but I didn't know who," she admitted. This was no coincidence. This was divine orchestration. How often does God place a mission before us, but we hesitate, waiting for more signs, more proof? Yet, faith does not always come with clarity. It requires movement, action, trust in the unseen. Hebrews 11:1 reminds us, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." With no map, no address, only a dream as their guide, they took a step forward. Together they gathered food, filling bags with the essentials: bread, rice, beans, water, simple things, yet life-saving in the right hands. Every item placed in those bags carried something beyond physical nourishment. It carried faith, faith that they were on the right path, faith that God would lead them to where they needed to be, faith that this journey was not their own, but His. And so they went. The man didn't know how, but he felt an unexplainable certainty. He knew exactly where to go. It was as if his steps were being guided, every turn, every road leading to something beyond his understanding. This was not just an errand. This was a pilgrimage, a journey not just to feed the hungry, but to witness God's hand at work. The destination was near, and what they would find there would forever change the way they saw faith, obedience, and the power of divine calling. There is a moment in every journey of faith where logic must bow to obedience. The man and the woman had no GPS, no address, no tangible evidence that their mission was real, only a conviction planted deep in their souls. And yet, as they walked, there was no hesitation. Each step felt divinely orchestrated, as if the universe itself had aligned to ensure they reached their destination. The wind whispered assurance, the sun bore witness, and the road before them stretched not just into the distance, but into the very heart of divine purpose. Faith. After. All is not about seeing, it is about trusting. When Abraham was called to leave everything familiar and journey to an unknown land, he had no certainty, only a promise. Genesis 12:1. When Peter stepped out onto the water, the waves threatened to pull him under, yet for a moment faith held him afloat. Matthew 14:29. This man and woman too were stepping onto unseen waters, trusting that God would carry them to where they needed to be. As they neared what the man instinctively knew was the right house, their pace slowed. The air felt thick with something unexplainable, a spiritual weight, as if heaven itself was leaning in to witness this moment. And then they heard it. From inside the small, weathered home came the sound of prayer. Fervent, desperate, raw. A voice pleading not with men, but with the Creator of the universe. They were not just asking for help, they were calling upon the divine, placing their last shred of hope in the hands of an unseen God. The knock on the door was not just a sound, it was the collision of faith and reality. When the door opened, the woman standing before them was already in tears, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You came," she whispered, as if speaking directly to an angel. She hadn't been expecting visitors. She hadn't told anyone about their situation. She had only prayed. And yet, here they stood, two strangers with arms full of provisions, guided not by knowledge, but by the whisper of God. In that moment, everything became clear. This wasn't about a persistent thought. It wasn't about coincidence. This was divine intervention, a spiritual assignment that had unfolded in perfect, miraculous precision. The family had been praying since morning, asking God for a miracle, and God, in His infinite wisdom, had started answering that prayer days before by planting an unshakable thought in the mind of a man who simply had the faith to listen. But the miracle wasn't finished yet. The greatest revelation was still to come. There are moments in life when the spiritual and the physical collide, leaving no room for doubt, only awe. As the man and woman stood at the threshold of that small home, they weren't just delivering food, they were delivering an answer. They were standing in the very fulfillment of a divine promise, witnessing firsthand what happens when God calls and his people obey. The woman at the door trembled as she reached for the bags, her hands shaking with emotion. Behind her, children peeked out, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. They had been praying for food that very morning, and now food had arrived, not by chance, not through human effort, but through faith set into motion. Tears fell freely as the family gathered around, hands lifting toward the heavens in gratitude. No one in that house saw this as an ordinary act of kindness. This was a divine appointment. The Bible reminds us in Isaiah 65:24, "Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear." This was not just about hunger being satisfied. This was about faith being strengthened, about hearts being reminded that God sees, he hears, and he moves in ways beyond human understanding. But the greatest revelation came to the man himself. As he watched this moment unfold, something shifted inside him. He had spent days questioning why this woman had been on his mind, struggling to understand what God was trying to show him. Now, the answer was clear. It was never about him. It was never about her. It was about what God wanted to do through them. So often people search for purpose, waiting for grand gestures or divine signs, when in reality, God's greatest works often begin with something as simple as a persistent thought, a nudge, an unshakable feeling that refuses to leave. Obedience to God is not about having all the answers. It is about trusting the one who does. When Noah built the ark, the skies were clear. Genesis 6:14-22. When Moses raised his staff, the sea had not yet parted. Exodus 14:16. And yet, they acted in faith, and the miracle followed. This man and woman had no guarantee that they were on the right path, yet they walked in obedience, and because of that, they became part of a divine miracle. The family continued to pray, voices filled with gratitude, and for the first time, the man understood something deeper about faith. Faith is not just about believing in God's power, it's about being willing to be used by Him. It's about saying yes, even when it doesn't make sense. And as he stood in that home, he realized that this was not just their miracle, it was his too. Because in answering God's call, he had not only changed someone else's life, his own heart had been transformed as well. But this realization led to an even greater question. How many times does God call people but they ignore it? How many divine miracles go unanswered because someone hesitated? How often do we dismiss the small whispers of our hearts, brushing them off as mere distractions or coincidences? In a world full of noise where logic and reason reign, it's easy to ignore those persistent thoughts that tug at our spirits. Yet throughout history, God has used these very thoughts, those silent nudges that refuse to fade, to guide His people toward something greater. Romans 8:28 reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." But how many of us are actually listening? The man in our story didn't know it at first, but his persistent thoughts were never random. They were a divine invitation, a summons from heaven to step into something beyond his understanding. And the truth is, God still speaks in this way today. He plants thoughts, ideas, and impressions in our minds, but it is up to us to discern them. When Moses stood before the burning bush, it was curiosity that drew him near, but obedience that changed his destiny. Exodus 3:3-4. When the young Samuel heard his name being called in the night, it was Eli who taught him to respond, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." 1 Samuel 3:9. The difference between a passing thought and a divine calling lies in our willingness to stop and listen. But listening is not enough. God calls, but we must answer. Too often people wait for undeniable supernatural confirmations before they act. They want neon signs from heaven, audible voices, or miracles written in the sky. But more often than not, God speaks in the still, small moments, the quiet urgings of the soul, the feeling that just won't go away. Elijah discovered this when he sought God in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, but found Him instead in a gentle whisper. 1 Kings 19:11-12. Could it be that we too are missing divine direction because we expect it to come in a different form? The greatest danger is ignoring these thoughts, dismissing them as nothing. How many prayers have gone unanswered simply because the person who was supposed to be the answer didn't listen? The man in our story could have ignored the persistent thought. He could have reasoned it away, convinced himself it was just a fleeting obsession. But instead, he sought God, he prayed, and he obeyed. And because of that, he became a vessel for something far greater than himself. God still speaks. The question is, are we paying attention? The next time a thought lingers in your mind, don't be so quick to brush it aside. Instead, take a moment. Pray. Ask God if it's from Him. And most importantly, be ready to act. Because sometimes what seems like a simple thought is actually an invitation into a miracle waiting to unfold. At the very core of God's plan for humanity is one command that echoes through eternity: love your neighbor. But love in its truest form is not just a feeling, it is action. It is moving beyond words and emotions into tangible, sacrificial service. In Matthew 25:35, Jesus declares, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in." This verse is more than an instruction. It is a glimpse into God's heart. When we serve others, we are not just performing acts of kindness. We are encountering Christ Himself. The man in our story did not set out to be a hero. He did not wake up with a grand mission or a divine strategy. He simply obeyed a persistent thought placed in his heart, and in doing so, he became the hands and feet of Christ to a family in need. That is the essence of spirituality. It is not about waiting for the perfect opportunity to do something great, but about acting in faith when God places someone on your heart. How many times do we feel a tug to reach out, to help, to give, but dismiss it as inconvenient or unnecessary? How many times do we ignore the small divine assignments placed before us? Jesus taught that love is not measured by how much we feel, but by how much we do. The Good Samaritan, in Luke 10:30-37, did not just pity the wounded man on the road. He stopped, he bandaged his wounds, he carried him to safety, and he paid for his care. That is love in action. That is the kind of love God calls us to walk in daily. It is easy to say we love others, but what do our actions reveal? Do we give even when it costs us? Do we serve even when no one is watching? Do we help even when it is inconvenient? God does not call us to comfort. He calls us to compassion. He calls us to step into the brokenness of others and bring light. And sometimes He does that by placing someone in our thoughts, urging us to move before we even know why. Imagine if the man in our story had ignored the call. Imagine if he had pushed away the thought, convincing himself it wasn't real. A family's prayer might have gone unanswered. A miracle might have been delayed. Someone's faith might have wavered. The weight of obedience is heavy, but the cost of disobedience is far greater. Love is not just a sentiment, it is a mission. When God places someone on your heart, it is because He wants to do something through you. The question is, will you answer? Because when you do, you will see firsthand that true love, God's love, is not just about giving. It is about transforming lives, including your own. And the greatest transformations happen when we stop waiting for the perfect moment to love and simply start living out God's call, one act of obedience at a time. Obedience to God is never just about the task at hand. It is about transformation. It is about what happens inside of us when we say yes to the divine call, even when we don't fully understand it. The man in our story thought he was simply delivering food to a family in need, but in reality, he was stepping into a greater spiritual awakening. His faith was no longer just belief, it became experience. He had witnessed firsthand what happens when God calls and His people obey. And in that moment, something shifted in him. He realized that walking with God is not about understanding everything. It is about trusting, moving, and allowing God to use us in ways we never imagined. How often do we pray for God to use us, but then hesitate when the opportunity arises? We ask for signs, for guidance, for a deeper connection with the divine, but when the moment of obedience comes, we shrink back. Why? Because obedience requires surrender. It requires letting go of our own logic, our own timelines, our own comfort. But here's the truth. Every time we obey God, we grow. Every step of faith strengthens our spirit. Every act of service deepens our understanding of God's love. And as we walk in obedience, we begin to see the universe through His eyes. to feel his heartbeat for those in need, and to live in alignment with our divine purpose. Throughout Scripture, we see this pattern again and again. Noah obeyed, and his obedience preserved humanity. Genesis 6:22. Abraham obeyed, and his faith became the foundation of a nation. Genesis 12:1-2. Peter obeyed, and his steps on the water became a testimony of faith. Matthew 14:29. None of them had guarantees, none of them had the full picture, but they stepped out in faith, and in doing so, they were transformed. The man in our story, too, stepped into the unknown, and by the time he walked away from that house, he was not the same person who had arrived. God does not call us to obedience because he needs us. He calls us because we need him. Obedience is the process through which he molds us, shapes us, and prepares us for greater things. When we say yes to his promptings, we step into a life that is no longer bound by fear, hesitation, or self-doubt. We begin to live in a divine flow where miracles happen, not because we seek them, but because we are aligned with the one who creates them. And once we have tasted the power of obedience, once we have seen what happens when we let go and trust, we can never go back to living the same way again. So, the real question is this: what is God calling you to do? What thought has been pressing on your heart, waiting for you to take action? The transformation you seek, the breakthrough you pray for, the deeper connection with God that your soul longs for. It is all on the other side of obedience. The choice is yours. Will you answer his call? Have you ever considered that you might be the answer to someone's prayer? That the thought weighing on your heart, the name that won't leave your mind, the unshakable urge to reach out, might not be random at all. It could be God himself inviting you to step into a divine moment, to be the vessel through which he moves. The man in our story never expected to be part of a miracle. He never thought that a simple thought, a lingering name in his mind, would lead to a life-changing encounter. And yet, because he listened, because he prayed, because he obeyed, he became part of something far greater than himself. God still works this way today. He still whispers, still places burdens on hearts, still aligns people at the right time for the right purpose. But here's the truth: he will not force you to act. He will invite, he will prompt, but the decision is always yours. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." But what happens when we don't trust? What happens when we ignore his voice? Could it be that miracles are delayed, that prayers go unanswered, not because God is silent, but because someone somewhere hesitated to be the vessel he wanted to use? It's easy to think that God only uses pastors, preachers, or missionaries for his work, but the truth is, he uses ordinary people, people just like you, to accomplish extraordinary things. He used a boy's lunch to feed 5,000, John 6:9. He used a widow's last bit of flour to sustain a prophet, 1 Kings 17:12-16. He used fishermen to spread the gospel across the world, Matthew 4:19. And today, he wants to use you. Maybe not in ways that seem grand or spectacular, but in the quiet, unseen moments where faith takes root and miracles unfold. So, ask yourself, who has God placed on your heart? Who keeps coming to your mind even when you try to push the thought away? Instead of dismissing it, lean into it. Pray. Ask God, what do you want me to do? And when the answer comes, when the conviction stirs so strongly that you can't ignore it, act. Send the message, make the call, extend the kindness. You might never know the full impact of your obedience, but rest assured, God does. At the end of the day, faith is not just about believing, it is about responding. The world is full of people crying out for a sign, for hope, for a reminder that they are not alone. And maybe, just maybe, the reason God has placed this thought in your heart is because you are meant to be that answer. Now that you know how God speaks through persistent thoughts, let me ask you, is there someone on your heart right now, maybe a name, a face, or a feeling that won't go away? What if that's not just a passing thought, but a divine call? The difference between ignoring it and acting on it could be the difference between a prayer going unanswered and a miracle unfolding. I want to hear from you. Has God ever placed a thought in your heart that led you to act? Share your experience in the comments below. Your testimony might inspire someone else to step into their calling. And if this message spoke to you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next powerful teaching that God has for you. And before you go, I have something else for you. Watch the next video that's appearing on your screen right now. It's going to take you even deeper into the mysteries of God's guidance. Click on it, and I'll see you there. This is Celestial Truths, and I'll catch you in the next message. Stay blessed.